Our first speaker of day 2 is Evan Barnes of Westmont College. He's presenting his work in collaboration with Ron Gray of Northern Arizona University and Anna Granath of Idaho State University. The title of the presentation is Talk Moves as Pedagogical Tools for Eliciting and Working with Student Ideas in an Undergraduate Biology Laboratory. Evan, you may begin when you're ready.
All looking good. Great. All right. Well, thanks so much for having me here today. I'm really excited to be presenting this study with you all. So my study is Talk Moves as Pedagogical Tools for Eliciting and Working with Student Ideas in an Undergraduate Biology Lab. And the purpose of the study is really to describe what Talk Moves TAs use during elicitation discussions and analyze how those Talk Moves function to elicit student ideas. All right, so a brief introduction. Eliciting student ideas is really the first step in enacting productive classroom discourse. And eliciting student ideas is really necessary to promote rigorous scientific understanding in the classroom. So there's evidence that supports that explanatory rigor in the student's talk actually can't be maintained without some sort of responsiveness in an instructor talk move. And it's really critical that we elicit student ideas because in order for the classroom community to use ideas from different perspectives, we actually need that thinking to be made public. But how do we then as instructors use certain tools such as talk moves or collections of pedagogical moves and moment-to-moment things we do while we teach? How can we do that to help steer more rigorous conversations in elicitation discussions? And by rigorous discourse, I really mean we frame it as helping students move toward an idea or helping students make progress on an idea. And this can be done in a multitude of ways, but it always requires some sort of responsiveness from a teaching perspective. So what sort of talk move tools can we use as instructors to help guide our students toward more rigorous conversations and understandings? And in order to do this, we used something called conversation analysis. The goal of conversation analysis really is to describe how TAs go about using these talk moves to elicit, or sometimes to not elicit, student ideas. And then we tried to identify elements of those enactments that were connected to more rigorous student contributions. And our conversation analysis came kind of from this idea from Tim Rapley, and this is a quote I really like from him, and it's, look with wonder at some of the taken for granted, seen but not noticed ways that we do social life through a close and detailed observation of people's action and interaction. So that's kind of some of the drive behind using conversation analysis for our study, which brings us to the research question, which is what qualitative patterns emerge in the sequencing of TA talk turns that elicit students' initial and exploratory ideas about the anchoring phenomenon of a biology lab investigation. So for this study, we examined 18 episodes of the same planned elicitation discussion that actually took place at the start of a certain week lab investigation. So these 18 episodes were collected from 6 different TAs in 3 different semesters. So each one is unique, but they all have the same central puzzling event and the same sort of discussion or the same, there's a discussion around the same idea. And then we use conversation analysis, like I said, to describe how the turns of talk unfolded and something we call adjacency pairs, which is basically a TA's talk move and then how the students respond. And we used a certain phenomenon in this elicitation discussion. So our elicitation discussion was split into 2 parts. The first part, students observe a video and then they make a model flow of energy. And then on the second part, they're actually introduced a puzzling event about this spring ecosystem. And they're supposed to try to come up with explanations for that. What we did is we actually took each TA talk turn and we analyzed it using a coding framework that we adapted from previous literature. And we grouped the TA talk moves into two categories. So the TA talk moves either fell into ambitious or conservative. And these were based on the function of each talk move to work with student ideas or thinking, that would be ambitious, versus checking for student understanding, that would be conservative. So you can see some categories here, and this is adapted from literature multiple places, but in ambitious category, we have probing questions, pressing students for explanations, distributing participation amongst the class, acknowledging a contribution, and revoicing. And the conservative talk moves, we categorize those in as checking for student understanding with display questions, evaluating a correct statement, and mini lecturing. So in addition to this, we also structured students' rigor with their explanations or what they were saying. So each student talk turn was analyzed using a framework, which we actually scaled from a 0 to 4, but we didn't code any 0 or 4s. So I've just shown you 3 levels here. And we have the lowest level of rigor was simply students responding with a definition or fact. The second moderate level is descriptions or observations. And the final level was basically explanation or proposing some sort of explanation. And here are some examples. I know we don't have time to necessarily look at all of them individually here, but this is to give you an overview of the different levels, different categories. So what we did is we actually, to help us identify patterns, we visualized the sequencing of each elicitation discussion, all 18, into one string of symbols. So we represented every talk move with either an A for ambitious or C for conservative talk move. And then we represented every student contribution as either a 1, 2, or 3 to indicate that rigor. And so we're able to visualize somewhat concisely how these are sequenced together, and we're able to kind of pick out patterns. And so here you can see the 3 different highlighted regions are depending on which rigor we're mainly focused on. So we have a rigor 1, rigor 2, and rigor 3, but they're all the same across as far as the episode goes. And then we have spaces to help us show where different ideas were presented. And then we also have the 2 sections of the elicitation discussion here. So you can see there's the model part 1, and then part 2 has explanation of the puzzling phenomenon, and there's a line that kind of helps us separate that. So this helped us really find a couple of key patterns that I want to talk about today, what we really found. We found 8 patterns, and we don't have time to go through all of these, but I really want to highlight a couple. So we're going to talk about pattern 2, pattern 7, and pattern 8. We're going to kind of combine pattern 7 and 8. But let's first look at pattern 2. Pattern 2 is that TAs used ambitious moves to elicit and expand on some of the observations and explanations of the students, but then they actually shift to conservative talk moves to elicit single word responses almost in a funneling way to try to get them to a certain point. We often see this near the end of the elicitation discussion. So I'm going to talk about that here in a moment. And then the other 2 patterns to talk about are 7 and 8. 7 is that combinations of actually these ambitious talk moves help maintain and elevate the rigor amongst the students and the conversations, and also explicitly using words like explain or give me an explanation helped also raise that rigor or sustain the rigor amongst student conversations. So let's talk about the very first pattern, pattern 2. Let's beware of the conservative funnel. That's what I like to say. This is not a political statement by any means. This is rather the trend we saw in our discussion. So a noticeable pattern we saw was that at the end of these elicitation discussions, we noticed the C1C or conservative, very low rigor, conservative kind of back and forth between students and the TAs. And this is interesting because if you even notice at the bottom here, I have episode 1 from a student named TA Fred. And right before this highlighted section of C1, CC, 1A, 1, all these, we have actually a section of pretty ambitious talk and pretty rigorous talk as well amongst the students and the TAs. But as we near the end, we lower the rigor. And this is problematic, right? And I want to make sure and have everyone understand that I'm not saying conservative talk moves are not appropriate or not to be used. They are very appropriate to be used at certain times. They're tools, and when they're used appropriately, they're really great at things like checking for understanding, using terminology. Sometimes even mini lectures are appropriate, but sometimes they aren't the most appropriate way to go about classroom conversation. And the fact that at the end of these elicitation discussions, we see this lowering of rigor, it sheds light on the TA's instructional decision-making. And it kind of shows us their goals, right? This trend kind of suggests that the TAs are less aligned with the traditional goals of an elicitation discussion, of getting ideas out and present and public. And they're more fixated on maybe leading students to some form of correct response or predetermined content. We can actually see this in the first line that I've put here of our transcript from our TA. He says, we still haven't tapped on one of the most specific reasons. So he's looking for a specific idea to be presented, and he's trying to funnel his students to get there using conservative moves, which unfortunately lowered the overall rigor of that conversation there. So elicitation discussion goals might misalign with the ideas of a correct response. And so TAs need to consider this. And I'll talk about how we can combat this here in a moment. The other kind of routine or pattern I want to discuss is kind of 7 and 8 put together. So I mentioned pattern 7 is kind of that conversations are really not sustainable with one single talk move, even if it's an ambitious talk move, especially at high rigor levels. Think about only pressing a student on their explanation over and over and over. It's just not sustainable. It's kind of like a child asking the why after everything, right? Well, the sky's blue. Why is that? Well, because of this. Well, why is that, right? It just doesn't get a lot of places. And so sooner or later, you come to kind of an end of an idea. So how do we as TAs support and keep that rigor alive? Because classrooms work together to build that rigor. And so instead of ending that process, we need to sustain it. Well, how do we do that? We found that the most effective ways of doing this amongst TAs that we looked at were using combinations of ambitious talk moves, often distributing participation with a specific purpose of building onto ideas that other students have already brought up. And this really helps maintain the rigor as opposed to just closing out an idea and moving on. Now, there's a time to do that, of course, but we found that using varieties of talk moves, specifically at the ambitious level, this really helped maintain highly rigorous conversation amongst students. But once again, I say here in this bullet point, consider distributing participation, but with purpose, right? And this leads me back to the point I made previously about conservative talk moves. They always have to serve as a tool for a specific goal. So we've seen in some examples I haven't provided here, but in some examples, the TAs use distribute participation, but it doesn't really help maintain rigor because they don't use those student ideas to build on top of. They simply use them almost as popcorn conversations, just to say, oh, what do you have? Oh, what do you have? Oh, what do you have? That doesn't get us as highly rigorous as building on those ideas. And then on top of all that, I mentioned maybe using explicit language, such as give me an explanation. What is an explanation for that? And right here, I've highlighted in red a point in which this TA in this transcript does a really great job of that. So with this explanation, how would that affect the snails? And we often see after language like that, we see students provide highly rigorous or fully kind of ideas about an explanation that they might have not have had if you would have just said, oh, tell me more. So what can we do? I've kind of explained some of these things already, but there's no perfect recipe for sequencing things together. That's not really what we aim to do. We aim to kind of give some ideas and give some examples for you to learn from, right? So by describing these patterns, we hope that TAs can better recognize the practices and be more intentional in the classroom. But there are some things we can do. Right off the bat, try not to use conservative talk moves to funnel, right? Because the goals of an elicitation discussion are to activate and explore multiple ways of approaching and thinking of a concept. it's not necessarily beneficial for TAs to lead students to a certain point or to where they end up at a certain predetermined conclusion by the TA, right? The students don't always have to do all the work themselves. Sometimes you can offer those ideas yourself and the students can then work with those ideas. So consider if you're running out of time, which is maybe what we saw with some of these TAs. They tried to get to a place really quickly by funneling down the conversation. Maybe try just offering those ideas yourself, that could be just as effective while maintaining high rigor in a class. And what else can you do? Well, try to use specific words like explain or explanations or tell me your explanation, or does anyone have any more explanations? We found that was really robust and quite powerful in our findings. And this is a very tangible and immediate implication that hopefully you're all able to do. I think that kind of wraps up my time here. So I want to allow time for questions. Thanks so much for listening. Thanks for my colleagues for also helping me with this project. Dr. Anna Grinnith from Idaho State University and Dr. Ron Gray from Northern Arizona University. Please email me if you have questions we aren't able to get to today or right now, but I think now is time for me to open it up for your questions, thoughts, and insight. I don't know if you want me to stop sharing my screen or what, so someone can chime in.
You can leave your screen up if you'd like, or feel free to take it down. If you want to leave your contact info up, that's great. But that was a great talk, Evan. Thank you so much for sharing all your research with us. Your first question in the chat is the conservative funnel always focusing on specific outcomes, or are there situations where the conservative talk indicates students are clearing up their remaining knowledge gaps?
Yeah, let me open up the chat here and take a look at
it's a long one.
I think that's from not from Dan here. So,
yes.
Okay. Indicates students. Yeah, I think there are times in which the conservative talk can indicate students are trying to clear up their remaining knowledge gaps, but what we saw is that it almost seemed directed by the TA. So the conservative funnel seemed to be the TAs pushing the students toward something that maybe they hadn't touched on quite yet. And so while there's times in which conservative, like I said, talk moves are really valuable in making sure to clear up gaps of knowledge gaps that maybe students don't understand. And we saw that throughout multiple places in elicitation discussions. We saw this funneling happen at the end of discussions, which appeared based on conversation analysis that the TA was directing students to get to a place that hadn't been brought up or an idea that hadn't been brought up. And that seemed to kind of lower the rigor altogether. Maybe that answers your question, Dan, I hope.
Yeah, thanks. That was what I was trying to see was there a specific, very clear, it was the TAs pushing to that, or if there might be cases that, so thank you.
Yeah, sure.
Great. I think we have time for at least one more question. So a question from Grant. Do you allow participating TAs to view these very cool data displays and reflect on their own instruction? If so, have you seen positive outcomes in ambitious science teaching reflection?
Yeah, that's a great question. We weren't able to do that with this current project, but I think it'd be really great to have that sort of a visualization for TAs to go back and look at. I don't know if anyone else, like my co-authors or colleagues have, I know Dr. Grinnith does work kind of preparing TAs. I don't do a class like that myself, but this would be a really cool way to implement and have students look at their own data. And I imagine we'd see some positive outcomes for sure, just having the knowledge of what to do, maybe what not to do.
So we actually might have time for this last question then. From Ben Wiggins, when you are coaching TAs to deepen their talk moves, do you expect better results from coaching deeply on 1 to 2 moves, or more broadly on the spectrum of moves they could someday practice?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I actually don't coach TAs. I was a TA almost myself during this process, not a part of the study, but I'd be really interested in coaching TAs. I think having them focus. Sometimes there can be so much going on with new novice teachers, especially TAs, that maybe giving them all these moves all together could be overwhelming. That's kind of my gut thought. And I think kind of coaching them on a couple of these, the patterns, maybe some people teach a different way than others. They have more tendency to do one sorts of moves or talks more than others. I think coaching them more on thinking of a couple of these patterns or a couple of the talk moves might be a more effective way than just kind of giving them a whole slew of them. But I would be interested in other people who have coached TAs on what they think about that. Because like I said, I haven't done that yet, but that'd be interesting. Thanks, Ben.
Great, thank you so much, Evan. So I believe that is the end of the Q&A session.